Patriotism, sir, is the last resort of scoundrels.
Some of the earliest lies I've ever been told was that America was free, that we have achieved freedom through the lifetime of this nation, that we fought against the British monarchy, and that now we are free, and that we have liberty and justice for all. But I think that the average Joe can also smell some bullshit within this very, very well-decorated cake. And that there's a very strong stench of disillusionment within this narrative. But even with this disillusionment, there is still the problem of compliance of the narrative. That even though we can smell the disillusionment within this cake, we still eat the cake. Even for someone who does not take the time to dive deep into the political sphere and the political nuance as to why America is corrupt, there's still a lot of complicity about America's corruption, as if it is the way things ought to be. There's still a lot of compliance within the America's status quo, especially during the 4th of July, aka American Independence Day. American Independence Day is built on a mythology of what America truly stands for. If America is a nation of free men, then I'm not necessarily going to contest that, because it is a nation of quote-unquote free men. There are men in the United States who are free. White men, cisgender men, heterosexual men. The narrative is there to comply with their form of freedom, with their variation of freedom, with their ability to step on others to become free. One of the biggest lies I've been told throughout my life is that the United States is a cultural melting pot, and therefore the United States is the greatest nation on Earth. This is partially true, actually. There's a half-truth within this mythology. Depending on what part of the United States you live in, and actually a lot of the United States, it's a very culturally blended nation. If you live somewhere like Los Angeles, New York City, Chicago, Atlanta, New Orleans, etc., you'll find a lot of people there, and a lot of people who are not from the United States. And guess what? They have a lot of things to share, stories to tell, delicious food and cultural traditions to expose you to. And thus, there is a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of learned experiences to have from these cultures. So, the narrative that the United States harbors a wealth of cultures is definitely something that can be justifiably argued for, especially at face value, because it is true. This is actually very true. And if I were to compliment the United States on one key point alone, this would be that point, that it does harbor a wealth of culture. But as this video is short, I'm not going to be able to talk about this in depth, but we have to remember how all of this came to be anyway. How did the United States come into fruition as an empire? We must remember the expropriation of African people who literally built this nation on their own feet, blood, sweat, and tears. All of their losses, all of their sacrifices that was coercively put upon them by settler colonists. And we must not forget not only the prolonged genocide of indigenous peoples, but the ongoing genocide of indigenous peoples, especially the loss of missing indigenous women. To this day, several missing indigenous women and children still do not go investigated by local law enforcement. Not to mention that their land, which has treaty protection under, still gets invaded by oil companies drilling pipelines unconstitutionally. And not to mention US imperialism still commonly exists today, invading nations of Latin American countries, rendering them with no form of democracy, and rendering them with no ability to fight back. And by no means it is exclusive to the Asian community, but Asian communities are still and heavily marginalized in the United States, especially in the height of COVID-19, where an entire diaspora is completely conflated, unjustifiably so, to the actions of a few scientists in China. Not to mention, to not understate the labor exploitation and lynchings of Asian people throughout the United States and its history. And another thing to mention is the Jewish community, who have dealt with centuries of anti-Semitic attacks in Eastern Europe and thus leading up to World War II as they have migrated to the US. Their story, while not exactly the same at all, is a little similar and has some parallels to Irish oppression from the British Empire, as well as the Armenian genocide which was enacted by the Young Turks. So the reason why I bring all of this up, because while they are not exactly the same, and some have suffered greater magnitudes of this than others, it's important to remember that people flock to the United States in mass, sometimes either coercively or there's no other choice. So when I hear people, especially US-born citizens, say something to the effect of, well, they don't have to come here, especially if we ruined their nation, wow, that is a complete divorce from any form of humanity within one's soul. You have to be so fucking inconsiderate, so fucking removed from any form of humanity or compassion within one's soul. If I went into your house and lit it on fire, and you asked to come live with me because I lit your house on fire, and I just said, well, why would you come to my house? You know, I burned your house down. Well, I don't know. If I burned your house down, I think you'd argue that I at least owe you a fucking house, you know what I mean? So me letting you stay at my house would be doing the bare minimum. I mean, of course, like in situations like that, a lot more is owed. And I think that's kind of the point, right? Because speaking as for myself as a settler, as well as other settlers on stolen land, I think we owe these several fucking diasporas of people that we have oppressed over the course of US history a chance to replenish themselves, a chance to be able to call whatever they have a democracy, a chance to rebuild, a chance to reclaim autonomy, a chance to fight for liberation, a chance to define their own destiny. And by extension, I think that the notion that the United States is a free and just nation for its own existence, especially on the notion that there is a wealth of cultures here in the United States, is disingenuous at best, and flat out maliciously narcissistic at worst. Some of these examples and stories that I have shared earlier in this video, especially the migration of Jewish communities from Eastern Europe to the United States, were the reason why the United States enacted immigration laws. The United States is anti-Semitic. The original immigration law that I am referring to is known as the Anarchist Exclusion Act, otherwise known as the Immigration Exclusion Act. An academic paper titled The Whole World is Our Country, Immigration and Anarchism in the United States from 1885 to 1940 by Kenyon Zimmer had this to say, quote, "From the 1800s through the 1940s, tens of thousands of anarchists were active in the United States. The overwhelming majority of them first and second generation immigrants, but most were not yet devotees of the anarchist cause when they arrived on American shores. Instead, a clear link existed between migration and the embrace of anarchist ideology." Zimmer continues by saying, utilizing anarchist publications, government surveillance files, and archival materials, it focuses on Eastern European Jews and Italians, the two largest segments of the anarchist movements by the turn of the 20th century, and the development of anarchism among these groups in the three important centers are American anarchism, New York's Lower East Side, Paterson, New Jersey, and San Francisco. It then follows that the changing fortunes of the movement in the face of war, the Russian Revolution, the First Red Scare, and the birth of communism and fascism, and ends with an examination of immigrant American anarchists participating in the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939, and that conflict's dramatic impact on the movement in the United States." End quote. A lot of Americans are just dumbfounded by the fact that there are protests today in the United States, wondering why are they protesting in a free nation like this one? Why don't they just pack up and leave? In the greater context of the US empire, as it is a functioning empire of dominance and coercive rule over the entire global population, with hegemonic violence and American exceptionalist complicity, especially remembering the entire history of how all of this land, and the way that it functions today even came to fruition in the first place. To tell someone to pack it up and leave if they don't like the way things are is not only insulting, but it demonstrates to people that you have no rhyme or reason of how to be able to critically think for yourself in the context of what is given to you by authority. And it tells people that you don't know how to question authority. And the only other reason why someone would say to pack it up and leave when someone is criticizing the way the United States is functioning is if there was a conflict of interest had they have not said to pack it up and leave. That person benefits from the very oppression that I have gone over in this video. In all of these instances, we must also remember their victories, and when each of these people groups that were marginalized, colonized, and otherwise oppressed by the US imperial foot fought back and won. Maybe that's why we need LGBT history education. Maybe that's why we need adequate sexual education. Maybe that's why we need Juneteenth recognized federally, taught in school, and thus critical race theory to actually be taught in school so that people can question the very fabric of what this nation even stands for and how this nation was even built in the first place. Because I cannot think of a less free peoples than someone who cannot question the very authority that is telling them that they are free.